Here's the thing. Episode 4. I'm here with Michael Brooks, Jeff Waldorf, of course. Another show, another weekend, another bunch of shit to talk about. Michael, welcome to the show, man. Thank you so much for taking the time out to join me this weekend.
Hey, man, it's an honor. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me on.
No, I appreciate it a lot. You're one of the smartest people, I think, that I know on YouTube. One of my, smartest colleagues. I mean,
Thanks,
you're doing
man.
Michael Brooks' show.
Thanks, man.
You're welcome. You're doing your show. You're working with Jacobin. You're doing a show with Annika Experience. You're a busy guy. Majority Report, of course. Dunking on Dave Rubin on Twitter. I mean, you're busy, and so I do appreciate that. Yeah, like you got a lot of irons in the fire, and it's kind of like you have to do that nowadays too, because of and I hit on this like every time how YouTube is kind of trying to shut down lefty media algorithms and really elevating so-called authoritative sources versus independent progressive voices and all that. So I don't know if you want to kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts about that. I mean, I think it's...
Share them.
Yeah, I'm also somebody who, I'm not going to lie, I mean, let me try to organize my thoughts on this. I'm not a big fan of the response to the extreme right and misinformation necessary. I mean, unless obviously misinformation is a tricky term, but I'm not somebody who ever thought it was wise to go to the platforms themselves, unaccountable tech monopolies with absolutely no commitment to the press or open cultures and barely any transparency and accountability, and just demand that they shut things down because obviously that was going to hurt the entire ecosystem. The real answer on a policy level is definitely things like breaking them up into their constituent parts, or nationalizing and turning into public utilities, which obviously companies like Google are. Inside the companies, forcing them to recognize that and this would happen regulatorily, that this is not these are not just neutral platforms. I mean, things like YouTube are in fact journalistic platforms, and you should have actual human beings, and journalism is completely collapsing. There's plenty of people to be hired to have some type of editorial oversight of different verticals. That doesn't mean controlling the content, but it does mean having a human eye on at least shows of certain size and helping make decisions that way versus through algorithm. And then, the last thing is that there is this bigger pushback that's hurting, and this is how it was always going to be. I mean, YouTube and other platforms like this have been a major breeding ground of extreme right-wing politics. That was an advantage for the platform, so the platform fed those channels for a while until it became controversial. And then if the answer was to appeal to the platform to sort of control content, that obviously was going to end up undermining all independent media, including the good stuff. So I think part of it, honestly, though, is just putting out good work and trying to get it in front of people, and so that's sort of off the top of my head. Right. Those are some thoughts on that kind of general area.
Yeah. So a lot of that's very structural, and so in order to get that kind of reform, you would really need a strong kind of governmental response, or a responsible government in the first place that isn't really, bowing to the whims of big corporations and advertisers and all of that. So that would definitely take a lot of work, and of course it would be great in the long term, and in the long run it would be great if we could get those types of reforms. It's just getting to that point. And so I think that could steer us towards a larger conversation about how do we even get there.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I think the only thing that and this is a bit of a different area than the internet, but there's an example from a university that somebody brought to me a couple years ago, and I really liked it in terms of how we should approach some of these fights.
Right.
And to boil it down, there was a group of students that was fighting back against the administration doing tuition increases. This is obviously a really important area. The administration cracked down on them for one of their efforts, one of their protests. I don't remember the specifics. They were got into serious trouble. This is a big problem. Now, unfortunately, what some of these student leaders did is they basically said to the administration, wait a second, there's this anti-abortion group on campus, and essentially you're not cracking down on them.
Right.
And of course, the administration's more than happy to crack down on any potentially disruptive student group. What the real move should have been is, hey, we're going to fight each other tooth and nail on policy and on such an important issue, but we should come together on this campus to try to preserve an open culture.
Right.
And so, obviously, I think there are some really extreme examples. I tend to be a bit of a free speech absolutist in some ways, although not because of a sort of nerdy, free speech, but actually very practically. I mean, I think, honestly, more open exchanges do tend to produce healthier, more dynamic cultures in some ways, and then also much more practically, if stuff is going to start to get cracked down on, the things that don't have independent funding mechanisms, that don't have infrastructure behind them, are going to be more jeopardized, and that's going to be left voices that are talking about corporate power. But I think, look, there's might be some real, some certain content which is, overtly Nazi or something, which I could be persuaded. Maybe I could be persuaded. But, a lot of this other stuff is toxic, it's right-wing, it's stupid. It could certainly be a conduit to worse things. But, people just went so over. The right response to these people was to take them on and beat them. And actually realize that they weren't that scary. To figure out what they were doing right, what they were being smart about in terms of how they were appealing to different groups, how we needed to do better. And then just having the confidence to take them on. That's actually been interesting because, the most effective things, even something as silly as Dave Rubin, it wasn't like, oh, take Dave Rubin off the air. No, keep him on the air. But let's talk about it. And, when we talk about it, obviously he's not going to do that well. So I guess my thing is, of course, you're totally right about the bigger policy stuff, and I know we'll get to it in a second, but I think completely getting away from the I want to kind of call your manager sort of mindset and much more into the, okay, you're an asshole, let's compete mindset is way better for the left and less dangerous, because at the end of the day, and we already knew this was going to happen, that as soon as your appeal to these platforms isn't to hit them regulatorily or to say you're a journalistic platform, so you need to conduct yourself as such, or to whatever, but to just sort of, pick certain people, maybe even the most egregious people, and then sort of make demands, that's going to spill out into decisions that essentially try to make YouTube look more and more just like corporate cable news. And that's what we're seeing, and that's a bad thing across the board.
Yeah, look, I'm with you on so many points because you hit a whole bunch of them. So let me go back and kind of and really agree with you on this point about being pro free speech, right? Pitting good ideas versus bad ideas. We're progressives, right? You're a progressive person. I'm a pretty progressive person. And of course, what that means is that we're in favor of policies that are that impact and help the most people. I think I know that's very reductive. That's very simple, but that's kind of where I come at it from. Is I want to help the most amount of people, and this is the kind of policies that I think would do so, like a Medicare for all system, right? And so I like the whole idea, and this is why I really loved YouTube at the beginning, right? you could really pit those good ideas versus the bad ideas, right? And that's what I liked doing. And now it doesn't seem like we're really in a space to be able to do that anymore. I mean, yeah, we continue to try to do that and to say this is why our policy positions are better. This is why we should adopt these policy positions. This is why they're wrong. But it feels like we're getting drowned out. I mean, when we talk about authoritative sources, right, going back to what I had said earlier, Fox News is an authoritative source. CNN is an authoritative source, MSNBC. You have Fox News that regularly puts out what they call fake news, right? They are artificially elevated within the YouTube sphere over that of independent media. And I know the reason that they point to is people like Alex Jones, who regularly tells people that he wants to eat his neighbors.
I will eat your ass.
Right? And so, like, okay, that's crazy pants, but, and you've got to go, and part of what I think a lot of us did at the beginning, I think, is point out those, crazy bits of the internet and go, these guys are nuts. This is why, right? Just for a little bit of fun, for shits and giggles. That's generally what I would do, but also to try to make a salient point on why we have better ideas than they do, right? Now it seems like we don't really get to do that. We're not featured anymore. We're getting buried by the algorithm, and what we need, as you said before, is more structural reform in order to really survive. And to get that structural reform, ironically, we need more independent voices to be able to challenge the MSNBCs of the world and get people to see that these ideas are better. And so it kind of feels like we're stuck in a catch-22.
Well, I think this is the paradox, right? Because I want to, because I guess I'm my politics. I guess I guess I kind of define myself. I do define myself as a socialist. Now, whether or not if that word's useful or not, I'm not that attached to it. But I think
it really depends. You know
depends.
What I mean?
But I think that what's important here is actually a little bit of a different way that I come at this, because as I was saying earlier, part of the reason I do think that there are some innate values to free speech, but I also think that if you are coming to politics from any sort of left, populist, anti-corporate, socialist, whatever perspective, you have to recognize that there is no lane for you. Even in academia, that's really overstated. There's a market for, there's definitely markets in media and academia for certain types of rhetorics of social inclusion. Very few to none if you couple that with an economic vision, right? So, Adolph Reed is not on cable news, right? I mean, I occasionally let, Cornel West is one of the only people actually who has mainstream media access, who will talk clearly about all the, different hierarchies and inequalities and brutalities of American society and capitalism. But so what happened is to me, it is, some people who critique the free speech stuff, they make a point that's half right. And they say it isn't just a question of whose ideas are better. The question is who has money, who has power behind certain ideas, right? Because we all know that, again, Dave Rubin, the quintessential example, right? The guy's an idiot, but he's got some backing, right? And, and again, he's also found an actual audience. There's no doubt about it. But there's a reason why certain things have eyeballs, and there's going to be a market in the mainstream for, let's just say, kind of Democratic Party, like somewhat socially open,
right?
And either nothing to say about economics or very corporate oriented, and then every type of right wing politics imaginable is going to have a huge amount of money behind it, because there's oligarchs that will personally fund it, or corporate media that will give people outlets. So the point, and that again leads to the other point, which is that so that when you started going to these platforms and you started saying, it's a win-win. It's like, okay, we're starting to get bad press for facilitating basically people being radicalized into some really ugly, grotesque alt-right politics. And also, the advertisers and everybody else would be more comfortable if this was just like corporate mainstream news anyways. And of course, we're not going to make any distinctions between, Alex Jones having some cannibalism fantasy and somebody doing meticulous work about the relationship between the occupation of Afghanistan and the heroin trade. And, so... And the last point I'd say is, obviously I work in media, and I definitely think telling different stories, presenting different histories, clearly arguing for policy and ideology is really important. But ultimately, and I don't know how we do this, I think we can actually support, I think this is maybe our primary function. If you don't have some type of revitalized labor movement in this country, that really is the area where there's an alternative axis for power. And that really is what, and you go back to Marx, that's the focus, is just like, as a mass working class, you have potential to withhold your labor, to do things like strikes, to organize. There's a different, and that really is the only, if the capital class has the money and they have the machines, this is how you do it. So opinion and ideas and all this stuff matters, but I think at the end of the day, who gets what, where, when, and how is what really drives everything. And that, again, actually helps you reflect and think more strategically, even when it's, satisfying to go after, some bigot scumbag on YouTube who's saying all sorts of disgusting things. And you should think to yourself, one is, what does the brands look like? Do we look like people who could take these people on, or we're going and running to the manager? I think that's something to think about. But even more structurally, is it really ever going to be a favorable playing ground for the left to go complain to unaccountable corporate oligarchs, particularly when we know that even the lowest right-wing bottom feeders could probably find some rich person to fund them anyways, right?
Right. So I just want to say I really enjoy how you basically consider the MSNBC quote-unquote left Karens.
Oh, without a doubt.
Going to the manager. But more seriously, though, so look, I've always been somebody who has a working class perspective. I've been a manufacturing, worker for, like a decade, right? So I worked straight out of high school in the factories. I've stocked shelves. I've, done all that labor stuff. I've been part of unions. I've been in non-unionized shops. And so I have that certain perspective that I think kind of is really lacking in both, media, corporate media, as well as independent media. I think the only person that we really had as a pro-labor pundit was Ed Schultz, the late Ed Schultz, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, you could see it in his politics, even though there were disagreements that I've had with him before, in the way that he did his show. He was one of the only people to bring someone like Bernie Sanders, who's also incredibly pro-labor, onto his show, even when MSNBC got, it really directed him to not do so. So those, to try to keep out those pro-labor voices. And that's really the thing, there is a lack of pro-labor voices. And a lot of us don't understand the power that we have in our labor. And what you were talking about, having a resurgence of a labor movement, that's been, it's really been overdue in this country. But I feel like a lot of us don't, feel that we don't have the ability to do so, right? The ability to organize. I've seen this anti-labor movement when I was working in those shops, saying, oh, the unions are worthless and all they do is take your money, and they keep the it's all these right-wing framing, right, where they keep the lazy workers there, and they get rid of the good workers, et cetera, And this was stuff that I heard when I was in a union. I mean, I've been to union meetings where 2, maybe 3 of the workers show up. And I think we've really got to change our mindset on labor, you know, and really kind of convince those who are in the working class, you know, to no longer adopt those that framing from the right wing, to be more pro-labor, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you know, I would want to hear your ideas and your thoughts about how to best do that, obviously. I was talking with a good buddy of mine, Dustin Guastella, who's actually going to be back on my show again this Tuesday, who's a Teamster in Philadelphia and does work with Philadelphia DSA, and is a really, really, you know, he's a great guy, and he's very strategically minded. And one thing he was saying, which it makes some sense to me, is that yes, there's been this decades-long propaganda war against labor, and people have been hearing all these lies. At the same time, that's also, again, that's also coming along with an actual war against labor, which, you know, you could go back to the 40s and say it kind of starts with Taft-Hartley and undermining what was happening out of the New Deal, but really accelerating, you know, with the neoliberal backlash starting in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And, you know, that means that labor is getting undermined and undercut, not only in the United States, but across, you know, the industrialized world, let alone in countries that are getting inflicted, you know, the World Bank IMF packages, or, you know, organizers in Colombia are getting, you know, murdered by paramilitaries. And believe me, I have no doubt that Coca-Cola knows all about it, right? So there's always a real war that goes along with the propaganda war. And what his point was that in the last couple of years, at least public opinion polls are showing that the propaganda war is starting to change. Probably just because things have gotten so awful, right? It's one thing, you know, 30 years ago to point out the mistakes and certain, stagnation around labor leadership, and then paint a vision of some future world. And then that future world arrives. People realize, wait a second, you know, they're driving an Uber. You know, they can't make enough money to protect themselves. They work at some of the most, you know, capitalized corporations in human history that won't even give them a mask or gloves. You know, and the guy is about to become the first trillionaire. Obviously, I'm talking about Amazon.
Right.
And all of a sudden, of course, people want labor unions, and of course, they're thinking about things like strikes. So, I think the part of it that involves public opinion is shifting. Now, there's an unlimited amount of money, and there's a huge PR and propaganda industry specifically designed to undermine and lie about labor, and it's utilized by all the, you know, every Fortune 500 company. It's very real. But I think we're actually starting to get to the point where, and I think this is just true across the board politically, where a lot of these things are just becoming, there's less ideological buy-in. It's more just basically, yeah, and what the fuck are you going to do about it? You know, if 20 years ago it was like, hey, we're got this new amazing economy and it's going to be great, and, you know, and you could feel, especially in the 90s, the economy, you know, you got a nice tech bubble going, and this Cold War is done. I think there's a lot more general buy-in. I think in today's world, less so. I mean, although on the other hand, the Democratic Party gets more and more upper middle class and more affluent. So that, you know, there's very little home for a real, you know, multiracial union working class. And obviously, you know, multiracial and working class is a redundant term, but I just want to be, you know, clear what we're talking about here. Because of course, we're rejecting and fighting against, you know, the way the Republican Party does white identity politics and religious identity politics to try to, undermine that broad-based organization. So it's a tricky time, but a very hard time. But I think a fair amount of people are less. I think some of the I think where there's a positive is I think some of the bullshit stories, and we could definitely thank partially how bad things are, but also obviously the Bernie campaigns for people to, and among other things, where people letting go of some dumb beliefs about things like unions, as an example.
Right. I mean, it's It's a great point that you had made, that it had to get so bad for people to realize. And look, I say this all the time on my show. It doesn't matter what ideology that you subscribe to. Everybody knows we're getting fucked. So let me give you a good example. So I went to speak at and I got invited by a right-wing group, right? They call themselves centrist or center-right, right? To go and do a panel appearance, right? Discuss different issues, right? So one of the things, not exactly a friendly audience for a leftist, okay? And I was with another person who also considers himself a leftist, right? And so we're there, and one of the things that we surprisingly got an applause for is how corporations are really kind of screwing us over, right? And how labor is no longer being represented, how these companies are, spending, billions of dollars on stock buybacks, and they're not doing anything for their employees. So it doesn't matter what side you're on. And this is sort of the false dichotomy that I think comes out, from conservatives, from corporate media as well, is that we're more divided, right? That's the false issue, is that, we're divided along these lines, when in reality, I think we're more united when it comes to basically trying to take care of our families, right? To trying to take care of, ourselves and put food on the table and pay the rent and pay the mortgage and try to have that American dream. And there are millions of people that have found out that the American dream really doesn't exist anymore in this country as it is.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And I think that there's no question that if you track along diminished economic prospects and lower living standards, there's a huge amount of output. There's a huge amount of overlap in this country. And part of what goes back to the sort of, the issues that the Republicans exploit with racism and xenophobia and everything else is that a lot of these policies that started in the peripheries, say Appalachia or deindustrializing inner cities, have just been expanded out to cover more and more of the country. That's why, in the 1990s, you get some racist tract like the Bell Curve, which is written basically to justify we're going to have this extreme inequality. We're going to do this brutal form of capitalism. There's nothing we can do about it because of, IQ test differences. It's just this ludicrous argument.
Right.
And then Charles Murray, a couple of decades later, I think in 2012, has to write a book called basically saying that, now the big problem is that the white working class has lost their morals and they're not disciplined anymore, and they're drinking too much and this type of thing, because you're just in one case it's racism and economic disenfranchisement, and in another case it's just brutal economic disenfranchisement. But in both cases you're just depriving people of the means to live their lives, and then you got to build a whole bunch of bullshit stories to justify it and to get away from the real questions, which are always economics.
And I love how it's pointed out as a character flaw. You're unemployed. It's obviously because you're doing something wrong. You're not working hard enough. You're not good enough. You should be able to go out and get a job, no problem. Just pound the pavement. Just go throw some resumes at people. This is something that I always get frustrated with because I had also had a period of joblessness in my early 20s, right? And it's one of those things where you're always you're trying to look for employment. You're trying to do what you have to do, and you're given all these bullshit excuses as like, all you have to do is just do this and do that, and you should be able to get a job, no problem. Well, that's not how it works anymore. This is at a point where a lot of the transition for just like resumes and applying for jobs went online, right? So you can't just go and drop off a resume to the boss and be like, hey, I hear you're hiring and I'd be a really good employee, right? No. They don't say, they kick you off the property if you do that, right? What the hell is this guy doing here? Get him out. Get him out. Like, no, you have to do all this stuff, apply online. And then, of course, it goes through all these different checks and credit checks even, which doesn't make any sense. You add in a credit check to an employment when I understand, like, okay, maybe for banking, right? Or something to do with finance. But, like, no, you get a credit check if you want to work basically anywhere. And if you don't have good credit, you're screwed over. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. How are you supposed to improve your credit if your job is dependent on your credit? So it's all these different bullshit ways that they try to stop you from being able to advance yourself economically. And you're kept in this bad economic position in life. And then you're told that it's your fault. It's bullshit. And I've lived that. Yeah. And living in that is one of the most frustrating. And you talk about, people drinking more and how, all that stuff. Those are diseases of despair. And so I avoided that, thankfully. But it does really take a hit on people's mental health, especially when you're talking about men, right? Male unemployment is huge. And it really does tend to lead to people more embracing those sort of alt-right kind of ideologies, going back to our previous conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you completely. And I think that, the idea that game that we play in this culture where we make it harder and harder for people to not just get ahead, quote unquote, but actually
but survive.
But to survive and to have some basic decency in their lives. I actually always remember a clip of the former Congressman Elijah Cummings, and it was really moving because he was talking about his district in Baltimore, and he's just like, look, I mean, I'm representing people who, they work hard. And, maybe they just want to be able to take their kids to a water park. Maybe they want to, just not have to be, endlessly savaged by these things. And then we couple that with all of these stories, whether they're racism stories, whether they're, the working class is this or that, or even stories that are, framed positively, but kind of bullshit too. Like, sorry, there's only but so many coding jobs, and it isn't just a question of a skills gap, and there's millions of jobs waiting in Silicon Valley. No, we've made a really conscious decision, policy-wise, for the last several decades to undermine organized labor, to ship good jobs overseas, and then say that, yes, there's going to be a handful of, relatively speaking, higher-paid jobs that are created in tech and information, although those jobs are also really precarious. And then we'll either have other people be unemployed, or we'll stuff a lot of people into the, freelance sector, quote unquote, or make them work service jobs, of which case we've made sure from the beginning that they're not unionized, that they're underpaid and everything else. And then, and then on top of it, we blame people and tell them it's because they're not smart enough and they're not ambitious enough. I mean, it's a sick system, and I think you're very right too. I think definitely, that is part of the equation for understanding what's going on with men and that dynamic as well. There's just no question about it, and also because, frankly, people want a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives.
Absolutely,
that's a really, really important thing. And so, it isn't just a question of, the material stuff is the most basic, but there's also, people want to feel some pride and dignity in what they do. Yeah. I don't think those things are just like myths. I think those are actually, they can manifest in a variety of ways, but those are definitely human needs. So Absolutely. We have this sick double whammy. And, look, I've definitely had years of my life where I've been unemployed. I've seen it, in my family. The compound of being in a situation that's terrible because you're broke and stressed, and then on top of it, feeling like you're a complete loser because that's every signal that's it's disgusting, it's sick, it's obscene, and they reinforce each other, of course.
So let me also add on top of that, a lot of experiences, like a lot of younger, older millennials, I should say, going into these predatory schools, right? So it's a situation where you're told that there's not a lot of low-skilled jobs. I mean, there are a lot of low-skilled jobs, but you're not going to really make a living off that. So why don't you go and try to compete for a higher-skilled job? Oh, but in order to do that, you need an education. Well, here we have this predatory education system, which is predicated on getting, federal loans, basically, or even private loans, in order to attend these universities, these schools, some of which are actually set up to be predatory, in the form of, private, for-profit colleges, right? And so you send a whole bunch of people into that in this, this with this sort of false perception that if you go through this and you pay all this money, well, that's okay, because later on in life you're going to be able to pay it back because you'll have this good tech job, right? Or this job that isn't really there, that's kind of ephemeral. And then you're stuck with a whole host of new problems, credit problems, gigantic amounts of debt, no return really on your investment of that money and all that time. And then you're often in a worse place than where you started. And so all of that kind of adds in together and creates this gigantic toxic stew. And it's just, I mean, you can look at all of this stuff together as sort of like a big picture of why we are in the position that we're in. Everybody kind of wonders, like, hey, how the hell did we get somebody like Donald Trump? Well, I think that's kind of the system that created people like that created this ability for people to vote for a demagogue.
I definitely agree. I'm also, there's a book that came out in 2017 called Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy by Tressie McMillan Cotton. And she's a really good writer. I guess I haven't read, I did read this book, and it's a great book, and it really shows exactly how these private and these online colleges, these diploma mills that are primarily in business to just suck money from the federal government. They don't help students get ahead by and large. Some of the only people, there were some kids that she was talking to, or some young men that were figuring out a way of, diverting some of their loans into working for their own startup business. And that was right. That was great. That was that was the best thing I read in the book in terms of them realizing that the whole system was gamed and screwing them, and they were trying to get ahead and use it intelligently. But besides that, it's just, it's a bill of goods, and it's absolutely disgusting. And again, that's just the only place. We just keep creating these markets because we push people out of, we're not going to have normal jobs anymore. We're not going to have the capacity to get ahead. And it's a weird double game, which is also a big problem, because, we were talking about this on my show recently about how a lot of people who are in the kind of professional class, they can't even conceive that somebody might want to work at the auto plant that they grew up around and make a decent living and take care of their kids and have a nice low-key life. Their only sense is, but who would want to do that? Of course, you want to figure out a way to test into going to a good college and becoming, working in tech or finance, or becoming a lawyer or a doctor, having no understanding and no sympathy that people might just want to be able to make a good and decent living doing something they grew up around. And that kind of arrogance then overlaps with this other kind of, fantasy entrepreneur superstar culture, where it's like, oh, you're not like underpaid, underemployed, and without a clear trajectory. You're starting an Instagram business and all this other, and that creates this whole other revolving door of bullshit products and services, from from online colleges to multi-level marketing schemes, and then it just sucks up what's little's left of people desperately trying to work out where they're going to fit into society and the economy. I want to say too, by the way, I'm not saying I'm all about people following their instincts and having dreams and having ambition. We can't in any way be opposed to that.
Oh, yeah,
And
of course
sometimes, again, I think obviously people do. I mean, look at having the opportunity of in some ways doing things we're doing. I mean, It can be great and it can be a legitimate aspiration, but at the same time, it should not be something that people feel obligated to do or forced into doing. And there's a whole lot of, it's another big cultural mythology. And I'll just say real quick, it ends up kind of going to the same place we were talking about before, which is like, you're a failure, you're not thinking positively enough and all this shit, versus again, it's the same problem. It's the economic policies we're deciding. We don't have unions. We don't have solid jobs. We don't have single-payer health care.
Right.
We don't have a universal federal jobs guarantee, which I think is super important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, like, I kind of want to shift over to, like, the Democratic Party. Early on, you talked about how they've kind of shifted in towards this more affluent kind of, position and no longer representing the working class. Before I do that, I just want to add on to that point where you were talking about, people don't always want to be their quote-unquote own entrepreneurs. And you're right that there is this big culture, right, of pushing people into, oh, you're a partner or you're a associate, right, which basically is another way of just saying that you're an independent contractor with no protections, no health care, no, union or anything like that, no representation. So there is that concentrated push into that. And to go back to people, not wanting to do that and how it's fine, I know so many people that just enjoy working with their hands. You know what I mean? They enjoy working at the plant. They're fine with doing what they're doing. I couldn't do it, obviously, right? I did it for so many years, and one of the questions that I always like to ask people is, I said, what do you think about when you're at work? And this lady gave me a strange look, right? She's like, what are you talking about? I was like, well, what do you think about when you're on the line, when you're working? I think about all sorts of different things, right? What I'm going to do later, like what movie I saw, or just whatever, like thoughts, right? I'm thinking about sometimes abstract shit, right?
Yeah.
And she responds to me. She says, "I don't think about anything. I don't think." That blew my mind because I couldn't imagine. It kind of goes back to, and this is sort of a funny, maybe not even related, but some people have an inner monologue and some don't.
Really? I think everybody must have some inner monologue.
That I would think so, right? But I talked to this person. She's like, I don't think at all. I just do. And that's okay, all right? The first...
Not only is that okay, that sounds... If that's even remotely true, that sounds really fucking desirable, actually. I think honestly, a lot of us are... I think part of the reason, actually, that you look for something that you feel some happiness and passion in is that you can get into that state.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the bigger point is that there is absolutely zero necessity, and it is a complete myth that people need to or should have to have some type of exceptional ability or capacity in order to live a decent life. And certainly when it comes to the things like housing, healthcare, food, I mean, I'm going to say that you can be, the biggest fucking asshole on the planet and you deserve those things. There's zero test for those things. And then even beyond that, if we actually had the proper value set and talked about and thought about time and work and purpose in the proper way, we could also realize that we could use the incredible abundance of not only this country, but really everywhere, to pay for people and support people in doing any number of things that might not even be recognized in the markets, right? I mean, there's people who are, they're great mentors, they're great coaches, there's great, But
everything has to be marketable in this country. You know what I mean?
Well,
everything has to be able to move a
capitalism,
product.
boss. That's capitalism.
and so that's one of the big problems, and that's one of the things that we have to kind of dispel.
I think it's the big one.
Yeah.
Or certainly one of the core big ones for sure.
And so to kind of add on to one of those points that you made, right? There are people right now that, I see this all over social media, right? That are like, how dare we pay people to sit home during a pandemic? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, it blows my fucking mind when I see people that are angry, like, oh, I don't want to get a government check. I don't want to sit home and not work during a pandemic. Dude, I get it. You're bored, right? But there's a virus out there that is incredibly contagious. We should be paying people to sit home. We should want that. You know what I mean? Like, that's one of the ways that we combat this coronavirus that's going around is to make sure that people can be home and be able to feed themselves. And of course, it's not just, talking about UBI, right? I've been advocating a lot of my show for rent and mortgage freezes, right? And, I've been talking about, like I said, a $2,000 a month UBI for until the economy at least picks up. Probably, in fact, going forward, right? Because that's one of the things that wouldn't be a bad idea. And a lot of people agree. I mean, there was a poll, 82% of Americans, they said that this $1,200 stimulus check isn't enough, and they think it should be monthly, right? Not only that, but, talking about universal health care, right? Most respondents to this poll wanted universal health care. That's even 76% of self-identified Republicans. 84% of self-identified Democrats said the U.S. should consider doing universal health care, like a Medicare for all system. I mean, this really... and I say this a lot. The pandemic has really forced the mask off of our current, hyper-capitalist, system. And it's really getting people to start thinking about alternatives, like a UBI, like you said, when the economy picks up, a federal jobs guarantee, and a, universal healthcare system like a Medicare for all and all that stuff. And so it is interesting to see that change, but it did take a pandemic in order for people to start thinking about it. In general. And of course, there's a lot of people talking about that before, the UBIs and stuff, thanks to the presidential campaign. And of course, single-payer healthcare because of Senator Bernie Sanders bringing this up in 2016 and really kind of repopularizing, among the general public, this idea of universal healthcare, especially after the failures of the ACA.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, and I think it's important to note that people with that sort of mega cuck attitude about wanting to go out there and get fed to Wall Street so they could work or whatever, this is a tricky point. It really is important to emphasize, as you said, it's really not that many people. Vast majority of Americans, of course, want what is obvious, which is to do things like federal paycheck guarantee, take care of everybody's health care coverage, and stay put until this is handled. That is the only obvious moral scientific path forward. And if we
so you're saying we shouldn't give all the money to the corporations, right?
I'm saying we probably should not give money to all the corporations, and we should probably allow people to live so they can stay home and not spread this disease. And, again, we are an extreme outlier in terms of the industrialized world in not doing this.
Are we the Florida of the world?
I mean, we're the New York of the world, I mean, let's be honest, right? I mean, New York has, Florida, sure, but New York has been a disaster. Andrew Cuomo has been an absolute disaster in this. Of course, the primary responsibility is obviously Donald Trump, and I would really recommend everybody should read Edward Luce's piece in the Financial Times on how the Trump administration has handled all of this. It really is just absolutely obscene, and there is something specific about having an absolute psychopath dealing with a pandemic that people do need to get real about. But, and then, there's some people several weeks ago who were out protesting and saying, look, I can't make car and mortgage payments. I get that, and I think that's an important thing to recognize.
Absolutely.
I think those protests have been fully taken over and monopolized by, the type of, fucking assholes that would go to the Michigan, state capitol with machine guns and all of that. So
that is my state.
I know that's your state. I know that's where you are, brother. But I think... So I think it's important. Again, this is another thing that we need to balance in terms of the messaging, which is to say we understand that all of these bills that have passed through Congress are massive, gargantuan. I mean, they're not only corporate giveaways. These are monopoly consolidation bills. These are financing and financializing with trillions of dollars the most powerful segments of our society that are already abusing the public in every way imaginable. It's corrupt, it's disgusting, it's grotesque. We've got, Steve Mnuchin, who should have been prosecuted years ago.
Thank you, Kamala Harris.
Thank you, Kamala Harris. This guy is now certainly the most powerful Treasury Secretary in modern politics. This is obscene. And of course, yes, like Bernie fought for and got some important stuff in terms of unemployment benefits, but the overall structure of this is absolutely obscene. And so we understand why some people are saying they need to get back to work because they aren't being properly supported, but that's a political choice. On the other hand, most people understand that on some level and they want to be properly supported, and we recognize that a lot of that sort of sentiment that you just want to be like a cuck for Amazon or Walmart is not that broadly felt, and we need to understand where people are legitimately saying that the government has not taken care of them as the government needs to, and then other people who are just, they're just sort of, there's something just kind of sad and pathetic about people being, willing foot soldiers of the most powerful forces in society who have no respect for them, who would gladly, who would see them die if it gave them, a dime extra on a stock point. So, it's sad and pathetic.
And those are great points. I talk about this being politicized, right? Wearing masks have been politicized. Social distancing has been politicized. And so it's not so much they're willing to die for, that's the ostensible result, right? Willing to die for Wall Street, for these corporate entities and these people with obvious investments in the stock market, which, by the way, is doing fantastic with now. Because, even with 38 million people now out of work, unemployed, that's the official number. I'm sure millions more because the systems are so outdated and of course, that goes back to the pain of regular people who are still trying to get those unemployment benefits. Florida, it was Rick Scott that set up the Florida system to fail.
Right.
For unemployment benefits. In Michigan, we're also having similar things. But I don't think that those are the same people, and I made this point on Twitter earlier, that they're not the same people, the people that are struggling through this but understand that it's necessary. They're not out there with Meal Team 6 and their bazookas at the subway, And so, there's definitely a difference in the messaging. They're using this as a political point in order to go after, Governor Whitmer, and let me clarify something, right? I'm not a fan of Governor Whitmer. Abdul El-Sayed is a wonderful guy, great progressive, right?
Right.
He ran in Michigan. He was derailed by a fake progressive. That's Sri Tanadar. Right. So his name should be reviled for all of history. By the way, he kind of disappeared, Sri.
Yeah,
didn't he?
I noticed that.
He's gone.
That was a weird story. I remember
that.
Yep.
So he got enough of the vote to derail Abdul El-Sayed, and then, Gretchen, here comes Gretchen Whitmer. But I got to give her credit for handling this better. Initially, yes, it was bad, but it got better. We still have a really high amount of COVID cases and COVID deaths, but it's getting better in the state. But as good as it can get in America, because according to some of these different scorecards, right, that are really ranking the response to COVID in the States, we're still at like a D. So we're doing pretty terrible. But the highest one I've ever seen is a C minus. So we're doing terrible here in the United States. Responding to this virus.
Well, we have no public health infrastructure in this country.
True.
The truth is that, look, you got a president who absolutely allowed this to happen, who didn't want to hear about it because it made him anxious and disturbed his fantasy world, and because he has no concern for human life. You've got a governor of New York who absolutely, I mean, there's a new Columbia study that I think if the lockdowns went in just even a week earlier, I think the number was 39, either 36 or 39,000 lives would have been saved. And then structurally, and there's this book by Laura Jarrett who is really good on this stuff. I mean, this is kind of her area of specialty, public health systems. She wrote a book called Collapse, which focused a lot on, particularly the developing world, but internationally on basically that there is not a public health infrastructure in place in many places to deal with a pandemic, which even, in 2000, I mean, people just knew was going to happen sooner or later. Obviously, and then of course you got with Trump, you got them, they got rid of the pandemic, preparedness team on the National Security Council, everything that could be done wrong and immorally is going to be done wrong and immorally by Trump and the Republicans. And then you have, Andrew Cuomo is still working to cut Medicaid in this state while this is happening. This is all on top of, again, in the United States, we don't even have a modern single-payer national health system to begin with. We allow these predators, these parasite HMOs and insurance companies that add zero value. They just simply suck up money and undermine care. This already has enormous health consequences in the population. Tens of thousands of people die a year prematurely because they either don't have insurance or are underinsured. And we have a patchwork. We don't have a public health infrastructure. So, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's maybe, okay, like obviously, look, objectively, of course, Obama handled Ebola, infinitely better than Trump is handling Corona. There are some relative differences that can be made, but at the end of the day, if you don't have a public health infrastructure, you're going to have a catastrophe. And let's also be really clear, too, because then people like Joe Biden using that fucking nonsense about Italy. Well, they have national health care. Well, yes, they have national health care. They also have a older population, and they also didn't act on the virus. The idea is not just that it magically takes care of it. You still need to do things like keep people in their homes. But obviously, if people have health insurance, that's going to help a lot in terms of dealing with the crisis. And then kick it over to Asia, where there's been the best responses. And, people love nerding out about the success of a place like South Korea and how they've used technology and tracing technologies and all the rest of it. Yeah, and Japan. But I mean, South Korea in particular, I know, that South Korea has one of the most robust universal government health systems on the planet. And their success is completely inseparable from that health system. So, of course we are where we are, and it's expected, and it's absolutely disgusting.
Well, and even the country that a lot of the right tends to point at as a model for us, Sweden, right? Sweden has a national healthcare system, and they still did everything wrong. They did not enforce social distancing. They didn't do lockdowns. They don't require masks. And shockingly, or not shockingly, they had a gigantic increase in coronavirus cases and deaths. They point to that as a success. Oh, they got herd immunity now. What cost? And there's no, I mean, look, as far as I know, right, and I could be wrong about this, but there's no indication. I guess there are some studies that say, oh, people do get an immunity, and then there's others that say we're not sure, or no immunity. There's so much we don't know about this virus, right?
Yeah, we don't.
But they point to that as a success.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny watching them. I mean, first of all, obviously, from all appearances, Sweden has obviously not been a success, and it has not been. You can just compare it to the other Nordics who haven't done the same. Who haven't been so loose and have obviously saved more people's lives. But in addition to that, I mean, when I first saw that reporting that Sweden was trying this, it's like, sure, Sweden, I mean, they shouldn't do it, and the consequences have been obvious. But just even the idea that you could take a calculated risk like this, yeah, because everybody's covered, because you have an infrastructure in place, and in the United States,
we don't have that.
I mean, we don't have that at all. It's disgusting.
And so to get over to the Democratic Party, right? Their response to this has also not been great. You mentioned Joe Biden talking still doubling, tripling. I don't know. Maybe it's quadrupling down at this point on not being in favor of a single payer healthcare system, and saying once again what you had mentioned earlier. It wouldn't have stopped this virus. No, but at least you would have people that are covered. Because while, yes, there are, 96, almost 100,000 people that have died from this, add in to and I forget, it was somewhere around 70,000 people that die a year from lack of health care. And now you have people, because of coronavirus, that are not going to get regular, doctor visits and things like that, or they're postponing going to the doctor for their conditions or various conditions and all that stuff. It's an absolute mess. And yet Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, is saying, no, we're not going to do what's necessary, despite the fact that most Americans, generally most Democrats, the vast majority of, are in favor of a single-payer healthcare system. I mean, it's insane that we're still in this position, that it feels like we haven't learned anything. And I'm not saying we, I'm saying the Democratic Party in general, or the Democratic electorate.
Well, I don't think it's a question. I mean, here's the thing. I would say, one, the Democratic electorate was clearly just primarily focused on beating Trump, and that's what it came down to. And there was a huge amount of effort to convince people that Biden was the safest way to do that. Obviously, I mean, Biden's safer than others, but I
Bloomberg,
think yeah, he's safer than a Bloomberg. I don't think Warren would have been a good idea in a general. I don't think a lot of the candidates would have had problems in a general. So, and then the other part is like learning the lesson. I mean, there isn't a lesson to learn, because that's not where their politics are. At the end of the day, between the campaign contributions from corporate interests and genuinely what these people believe. I mean, these people are, by any standard measure, I mean, the Democratic Party leadership is center-right. Yep. And they are deeply close with all of the main factions of corporate America, and they believe in it. People like Joe Biden, going back to the 70s, have helped remake the Democratic Party, turn it away from organized labor, while also being willing to move to the very far right on issues of race, as an example, and race baiting. And, the difference, I think, people get confused. I mean, yes, the mainstream Democratic Party leadership is more woke or whatever than it was in the 90s. But, again, there's very little substantive. I mean, that doesn't mean, okay, so what's a real strategy for ending, the corporate exploitation of urban America, as an example. I mean, in fact, it's the opposite of that. I mean, Hillary Clinton infamously with that, one of the most demented lines in history, like, regulating Wall Street wouldn't solve racism. I mean, first of all, it actually would absolutely have impacts on racism. And also, I mean, okay, I guess, sure. So Hillary, what is this speech you're doing on why we need to bomb Libya or whatever else? I mean, it just, but the bottom line is that I don't think there's a lesson to be learned, because this isn't where their politics and who they are is. So we got to just get out of that. We got to recognize that this stuff isn't about opinions. It isn't about lessons. It's about class conflict. It's about political differences. It's about different material interests. Now, I'm somebody unpopularly, I guess, for some people. I dissatisfy everybody. Because on this side of, with this specific question, because, a lot of people have they're really invested in a fantasy story about the Democratic Party and how it's changing and all this stuff. And arguably, actually, the macro trends, I mean, on the big policy issues as they're actually coming in terms of reality, the response to this crisis is worse than 2008 and Obama. I mean, at least with Obama, you had a semi-decent stimulus along with recapitalizing Wall Street with no real accountability.
Yeah.
In the 90s, Bill Clinton campaigned. I think the number was we aren't going to raise taxes on people making above 100,000. I think Biden just said people making above 450,000. And most of the new congressional energy in the Democratic Party are, we're talking about literal former like CIA officers. I mean, people running
McGrath,
resistance campaigns with no substantive interest in any core issues, basically just running and saying that Trump is a bad guy across affluent suburban districts. So, okay, that's on the one hand. And, it's great. Right. I'm very glad. Of course, I support Rashida Tlaib and so on. But this is not where the power, and we certainly, Rashida has a primary. We need to support her and keep her seat, no doubt. But this is not where the power is flowing in the Democratic Party. Now, on the other hand, look, I think, another term of Trump is very bad for what politics is today, which is that we're not going to get Bernie Sanders. So an actual reform agenda is off the table for at least another several years. Right. And so the only question is like, what appointments do you get to the National Labor Relations Board? What, and just because of basic institutional vested interest that still exists in the Democratic Party, as obscene and awful as it is, they're going to be marginally better than under Trump. Well, Trump, in a second term, they're going to kind of really accelerate the erosion of civil liberties, the divisions across society, the vicious and grotesque treatment of asylum seekers and immigrants and so on. And so, it's like, I'm sorry, people don't like it, but sure, you vote tactically, you do a little bit of harm reduction. I guess, harm reduction. You do a little bit of that. That's not that complicated. That takes about 2 minutes to figure out. And then the real question becomes, what is it going to actually need to take place to reshift the contours of politics? And I think there's, and again, I think it's got to come through labor, but we don't know how, and we just got to keep kind of working to figure it out.
Well, I've been a favor of general strikes, right? So that's something that's really kind of the only thing, leveraging your labor, your work, your output to, proverbially throw a shoe in the machine, right? A sabot. Right? And to kind of shut everything down, to kind of show that, yes. One thing that we thought, like I originally believed at the start of this pandemic is, well, at least, now people will see that essential workers are truly essential. I don't think a lot of people have learned that. I think they're still considered to be throwaway. We've seen a lot of people that have died, essential workers that have gotten COVID because they're not being protected at work. A lot of companies getting away with a lot of bullshit. So same as usual. And that's part of our response in how terrible it is. And so it's one of those things where we have to leverage our labor. Now, to go back to harm reduction and voting tactically, I generally get that, right? I'm somebody, and you can disagree with me, obviously, if you want, but I'm somebody who wants to openly leverage his vote for some sort of concession, right? And really, even if we get a small concession, that's at least something, is better than nothing, right? But I'm willing to go out there and publicly say, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do it, but I will not vote for Joe Biden unless we get this, right? It's an implied threat, even if you don't tend to follow through with it, because we know how disastrous President Trump is and would be for the next 4 years. I don't know if you think about that strategy, that tactic.
Yeah, I think I get where you're coming from. And this is another thing, though, that it kind of actually involves it could speak to the general strike, too, which is that I don't think you should write checks, and we should not write checks that we can't cash.
Okay.
If we were in a position to have an actual general strike, and strategically, there's a lot of questions to ask, because right now someone pointed out that you could look at the whole bailout packages as almost an endless anti-strike fund, right? I mean, part of the reason that strikes start to work is they actually threaten the bottom line. But regardless of that, I hate when people come out and they say, we need a general strike. Let's tweet about it. And okay,
and then don't do it.
And if nothing happens or it's marginal, that just reinforces how marginal you are. And so I start to feel this way with the voting for Biden thing. This is another thing that, pissed off vote blue no matter who people. But I said a couple of months ago, and it would have, it already just wasn't practical because it was not the decisions that were made and taken to begin with by the Sanders campaign and others. But I mean, if you could say to Joe Biden and you wanted to play the game like this, look, I've got probably a block of about, I don't know, so let's say there's 6 million people that you could pretty clearly say are just absolutely not going to vote for you unless unless say, okay, Nina Turner's vice president, you reverse course on one or two major actual issues, you give a couple of other commitments, there's, no Mike Bloomberg, no Jamie Dimon in the cabinet, and that's the bargain. That's it. I would be very interested in doing something like that, but that's that's not there. So it starts to feel again like kind of the same principle. Like yes, on one hand, there's a lot of fixation and obsession and whining from these people on MSNBC and on Twitter about, the Bernie bros aren't going to vote for whatever. But the truth of the matter is that clearly the Biden campaign is very comfortable that they can get enough of those votes or blow off enough of those votes to win. And they could be right. And we lost. And there was no backup strategy. So to me, my question is like, what can actually be done in the real world? I know I keep saying labor because that's my sense. But I'm sure there's other things. It's an open process. What can be done to actually try to build something here that has actual power? And I think that, the whole game of like, the truth of the matter is like, I don't know. I don't think it makes that much difference. And I don't think it looks that strong. Like, I think why play a game that you're going to lose? Now, and the only reason I advocate voting strategically is because I do think at the end of the day, you do have to look at things like appointments, and you do have to look at things like, especially when the left is so weak and so under siege, could you do, the next 4 years could be the difference between different types of structural body blows. But the truth is that it's really bad either way. And in order to play the game that you're talking about playing, there would have already needed to be a very different set of decisions to feed into that. And I just don't think that's there. And I'll tell you anecdotally, it's interesting because some people I talk to, they're just not going to vote for Biden. They never were going to vote. I mean, they're almost like they're not even really democratic or persuadable voters. They were going to vote for Bernie, or they're not going to vote, and that's it. And then there's people that were going to vote for the Democratic nominee no matter what, right? And so, even to organize that, I don't know how effective it would be. So my thing is just, how do you cut your losses? How do you deal with something in a real way and as non-melodramatically as possible? And then how do you think seriously and strategically about the future? That's my thought on it.
And those are the questions that us on the left in the movement really need to consider, and we need to come up with answers about, because we are back in the wilderness. We don't have the power, and we have a lot less than we believed. I thought that we had a chance. I even thought that before, independent media was going to kind of wrap this up quickly. I thought that we, really kind of had a voice, and it turns out, no, we really don't. We're really out in the fields. We're really out in the wilderness, as I said before, and we've got to find a way to get in. And that's not going to happen overnight. That's not going to happen in 1 or 2 election cycles. This is going to have to be a long-term, sustained effort with, I think, multiple fronts, multiple strategies to try to gain some of that power to really affect change. And right now, I'm not sure, and I think a lot of us are not sure where to start.
Yeah, I think that's true. So I think the best we can do is, again, I think if you're in a capacity, I think there actually are some funds for people that were striking, like these fruit pickers in Yakima as an example. This is actually a time, paradoxically, where it really is valuable to try to read some books, to try to do some actual long-term thinking, get away from all the stupid social media dramas and and moralism and gossip and freaking out and all this, and really try to think and really try to see what maybe we could do to be productive. And Jeff, I just want to say, man, I know you're part of that. And I really dig your show, and I'm really honored that you had me on. And
appreciate it.
It's great watching you put it together, man. So thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Michael. I do appreciate it. I enjoy watching your show as well. You make me feel smarter, because you're an incredibly smart guy, and I feel like it's learning by osmosis. And so, thank you again.
Same, brother.
I appreciate it. Michael Brooks, hey, what are you working on? Where can people find you?
I would go to the Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. If you want the whole thing, go to patreon.com/TMBS. You will get a lot more content that way. Definitely watch Weekends with me and Anna, and subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube channel, me and Anna Kasparian. You can also find me on the Bomb feed on iTunes with Woke Bros. And Wednesday and Thursday, Wednesday I co-host the Majority Report, and Thursday I'm the main host on the Majority Report. So check it out.
Absolutely. Check it out. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks,
Thank
brother.
you guys. Thank you for listening at home, and stay safe. Wash your hands. Have a great weekend. Enjoy your holiday. We'll see you next week. Here's the thing that's made possible by your generous donations through patreon.com/TYTNation. Sign up to become a patron and get early access to today's episode. That's patreon.com/TYTNation.